Okay. Right. I think we're going to get started. Keep things on time, even though people are still joining. So we'll start anyway. Okay. Welcome. Welcome, all of you who are here today. I'm really honored. I'm honored to have you all join me in this conversation. I'm super honored to have really amazing speakers tonight, each one a force in her own right. Truly honored that you're all taking the time to be here and be part of this conversation. I'm Elana Sztokman, in case we haven't met. Nice to see you all. So tonight we're going to be talking about my new book, In My Jewish State. The way tonight will go, just before we start chatting, is I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes, and then each of our speakers is going to speak, and then we'll talk with each other a little bit, and then there'll be room for questions at the end. So feel free to write your comments and your questions in the chat as we go. So, right. I want to tell you a story. The day after October 7th, 2023, the October 7th, I woke up in the morning to my WhatsApp pinging me. And that wasn't the first time that that happened, because the day before, on October 7th, my whole day was WhatsApp pinging. So since October 7th, this has been a period of lots of WhatsApps and lots of groups and lots of emergencies and not wanting to miss anything. So this time, the WhatsApp pinging me was a little bit of a surprise. It was my high school alumni group. I had been added overnight to an alumni group from my Brooklyn yeshiva days. Someone, I guess, thought that it was a good idea to get me involved in the discussion that had to do with supporting Israel. So, in case you don't know this about me, I've been living in Israel for 30 plus years, since 1993, and I came here as a young, religious, married mother with my head covering and my long skirt and everything. And, October 7th was a very busy day for us. I didn't really need to be explained what October 7th was. On October 7th, at 6:30 in the morning, it was my daughter pinging me. Actually, I woke up on October 7th with lots of sounds from my upstairs neighbors. There was banging. The windows were banging. The windows were rattling. There was banging on top. And in my half-asleep state, I thought to myself, my upstairs neighbor is having quite a workout this morning. Because that's what it sort of felt like. It felt like this constant banging on the floor of like someone dropping weights. And then the pinging of the phone started. And then I opened up the pinging, and it was my daughter in Ashkelon saying, Ima, we're under attack. We're on our way to you. This, of course, was Shabbat and Chag and the holiday of Simchat Torah, and that was a little bit unusual. So I jumped up, and then the banging and the pinging and the da-da-da-da-da. So that's when I looked at the news, and that's when I saw what was happening. My daughter came an hour later with her husband and young baby, her 3-month-old baby, and stayed for 3 months. Her husband went to reserve duty, where he stayed for 11 months. And then he came home for 6 weeks, and then now he's back in there. They haven't been back to Ashkelon. They moved out of Ashkelon. Anyway, that was part of what October 7th was. The other parts were my other daughter, who lives in Beersheba, also came with her kids while her husband went to reserve duty. My son, who lives up in Haifa, also came, and he was called up. And my youngest daughter was in the Army service to begin with. So all of my 4 kids were doing their Army stuff, and they were all affected. So we were very affected by October 7th. And so I didn't really need my alumni group to remind me to support Israel, because I was supporting and experiencing. Nevertheless, I was joined to this WhatsApp group. And in the WhatsApp group, somebody wrote in something to the effect of, kill them all, in Gaza, like just destroy them all. And then came on a surprise voice, which was my high school Zionism teacher. My high school Zionism teacher, who I didn't even know was still around, because I'm 55 years old, so I would have had him literally 40 years ago as a teacher. He came on, and he started sharing a lot of very Channel 14 type content things, also having to do with this idea of, raising Gaza. And so I wrote into the group and I wrote, you realize that the people in Gaza are human beings, right? And that started me in a conversation with a classmate of mine who was running the group. We started private messaging, and she said, we're really worried about you. You should probably go back to just being a grandmother and let the rest of us do the thinking, that kind of thing. So for the fact that I mentioned the radical idea that people living in Gaza are human beings, for that, I was declared too old to have a brain and possibly mentally ill. And so that experience became a very formative experience for me with the October 7th aftermath for a few reasons. One has to do with this very dehumanizing language that we've all sort of become accustomed to. And also this really strange realization that I had about this cycle, that somehow this language that I had been inculcated into as a teenager in my yeshiva days was still here in full force. And somehow there was this direct line from Brooklyn to Modi'in via Gaza or something like that. And so I started I don't know if I started, but I sort of continued. I had been taking an interest in this language of the war for some time, but I started to sort of quietly collect some of these conversations, in part using my anthropological hat. I have a doctorate in anthropology and I've written a bunch of books on research and stuff, and I like to research. That's sort of like my tool for grappling with hard things. One of my tools for grappling with hard things. So I started collecting some of this language and some of the things that I was seeing and experiencing. And I started to sort of analyze it. I never stopped really engaging in social media. Maybe towards the beginning of the war, it was on a lower flame. I think a lot of people for the first month, maybe 2 months, were sort of very careful in what we were saying on social media a little bit, maybe. But at a certain point, I realized we can't keep doing this. This whole idea that we have 50 years worth of this messaging, this dehumanizing messaging that is being said in my name, that my alumni group is sort of, saying we're supporting Israel, which in theory is supporting me, the people living here, among the people living here and experiencing it. Something felt really wrong. Anyway, that's how this book was born. This book was born as a way to analyze some of this language. And I decided in this book to also write some of my own story. So I wanted, which is a little bit unusual for me. I don't usually do that in my books. I prefer to use my anthropological hat, but it just sort of felt like these things can no longer be separated, and all of this is personal. It's both personal and professional and political for all of us. So the book that I wrote is in 3 parts. The first part is a little bit of my telling my story, especially since October 7th, and just in general, how I came from being the yeshiva girl in Brooklyn to what I am today. The bulk of the book is an analysis of social media messages, and the end of the book is the peace work and the optimism and the hopes for change, along with the challenges. Quite a few challenges. The challenges still exist. So that's what I put in the book. It's sort of like a little bit of a mishmash of things, to tell you the truth. It's a little bit of my sociology hat and a little bit of a memoir and a little bit of political analysis. But I thought, we're living in a time of mishmash. So here we are. So that's why I wrote the book. And for those of you who've read it, please share your comments and your thoughts and your questions. Okay, so tonight we have 3 amazing commentators on the book. We're going to start with Judy Maltz. Hi, Judy.
Hi.
Judy is a senior correspondent for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, an award-winning journalist and a filmmaker, and she was one of the founding editors of the Haaretz English edition. She recently completed a 1.5-year stint as Haaretz correspondent in the United States, where she covered Jewish American community life and was able to witness firsthand the impact of the events of October 7th on Jews living outside Israel. And she currently serves as the paper's Jewish World editor. Welcome, Judy. The floor is yours, or the screen, as it were.
Ilana. As you know, I had the privilege I think, being the first to interview you about this book, right?
Yeah.
So you know that I love the book. I really thought it was an amazing book, Ilana, and it resonated with me in a very personal way on so many levels, which we discussed. I almost felt like you were telling my story as well. I mean, we both grew up in what was known as the modern Orthodox world. We both attended yeshiva day schools and yeshiva high schools. I guess I was a little bit more fortunate than you because Meir Kahana and Baruch Goldstein did not attend my yeshiva high school. Um, we attended the same Zionist youth movement, B'nai Akiva. We both went to the same overnight camp, in the Poconos, Camp Moshava. We both ended up at Barnard College, though not the same years, and that's why our paths never crossed. And I just learned something else that we both share. We both have 4 kids. So we've got a lot in common. And I guess maybe the most important thing that we have in common is that we both rebelled against our upbringing. And I think that's pretty rare among immigrants who I know, and you probably know, it's not a very typical thing for those who grew up the way we grew up with our backgrounds to rebel in this way. And I think both religiously and politically. So I just wanted to talk about a few of the insights in your book that really spoke to me. And you mentioned before the school WhatsApp group, which was a story, an anecdote that I love that is in the introduction to your book. And you remember my interview with you. The story that was eventually published, I led with that because I thought it really said so much about the book, that experience and what brought you to write that book. But like you, I'm in a number of these WhatsApp groups, both a high school one and a college alumni WhatsApp group with many of the same people from my past, from the Orthodox Jewish world, mainly in the United States. And I think they're a great way, these groups are a great way of seeing where people's heads are at. Most of the people in these groups, unlike us, they still live in America. And for the most part, I would say that they haven't moved on. They're still somewhat stuck in the 70s, like your school teacher from your yeshiva high school in Brooklyn was and is. For them, Israel can do no wrong. For them, any criticism of Israel's actions is anti-Semitism. For them, God gave the land of Israel to the Jews, and anyone else who wants to live on this land must do so as more or less a second-class citizen. Many of them see nothing wrong with people like Bezalel Smotrich or Itamar Ben-Gvir. And in fact, if they had the right to vote, they probably would have voted for them in the last election. As you wisely noted in your book, to understand Ben-Gvir and what's happening in Israel now, you have to understand Brooklyn, the place you came from. In other words, you need to understand the environment where his mentor was raised, that mentor being Meir Kahana. And as you rightly observed in the book, that ideology has unfortunately found its way into Israeli society, especially in recent years. And I would not be surprised if, in fact, many of the people who voted for Ben-Gvir in the last election are some Orthodox Jews from the West Bank who came originally from Brooklyn. And as you know, there are many of them. So I don't know about you, Ilana, but I haven't left any of these WhatsApp groups because I'm kind of fascinated in a weird way with the discourse that goes on in there, but I obviously don't engage because I've reached the conclusion that it's pointless. And also, I'm a reporter, so I'm not supposed to share my opinions, even though I'm doing a little of that right now. So you talked, you just recently talked about the exchange you had with that friend of yours or former friend who was an administrator of the WhatsApp group, who kind of said to you, don't you know what's going on in Israel? And that, I get that as well a lot. Like, Judy, don't you know what's going on in Israel? And I can say that, no, not only do I live here, not only have my kids served in the army here, not only do I pay taxes here, but I actually have been my entire life a news reporter here. So I definitely know what's going on. And, when you get those comments, it makes you wonder, where are these people getting their information from? I have some ideas, but we can talk about that later. But, where do they get some ideas that are so detached from the reality in this country and feel so confident about what they're saying? The other thing that really struck me about your book, and I've also experienced this as well, especially in America, you wrote in there about how deeply Jewish Americans were affected by October 7th. Now, obviously, that's to be expected because it was such a catastrophe, as we constantly say, the worst single-day massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. But it happened in Israel. It didn't happen in the United States. And what fascinates me in a way is sometimes you get the feeling that American Jews actually feel like they lived through it more so than the Israelis who did. And I don't know how to explain it, but I know you wrote about it, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. But in general, I want to say that your book got me thinking a lot about what has happened to the religious Zionist community in America, and what made it move so much to the right, both religiously and politically. And by the way, this has happened in Israel as well, but I think for somewhat different reasons. So I'm a few years older than you, Ilana, but I think that a lot that change happened between the years that the two of us were in high school. When I went to Barnard, the school was pretty much half Jewish. And in Columbia, when I was there, Columbia was still all male. It was very common to see boys walking around with kippot on their heads. It was basically the go-to school for kids from yeshiva day schools from around the metropolitan New York area. Now, I spent a lot of time at Columbia last year covering the protests there. And one thing that stood out to me was how few visibly Jewish kids there were on campus, at least compared to the years when I was there. It was very, very different. So what happened? Here's my theory. When I was a kid in Bnei Akiva, the movement was very different. This was there before there was much of a settlement movement in Israel. Before there were places like Efrat or Ma'ale Adumim, the dream of every Bnei Akiva graduate at that time was to make Aliyah and move to a religious kibbutz. And at the time, it was very common for boys and girls to do Israeli folk dances together, holding hands. The girls wore shorts in camp up to their knees, but still it was shorts. We went swimming together, boys and girls. And even the married women who were on staff at the camp, none of them covered their hair. So what I think happened is that Jewish parents got scared. They got scared of intermarriage because once they started sending their kids off to non-Jewish colleges, what inevitably happened was that they would meet non-Jews and sometimes fall in love with them. And this was, at least when I was in college, it was the famous period of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And Orthodox Jewish parents were terrified that their kids would get involved in those things. So they started building walls around them, walls to prevent them from interacting with non-Jews and even non-Orthodox Jews. And these were walls to prevent them from being exposed to any temptations of the outside world. So the rules of kashrut got stricter, the rules of Shabbat got stricter. Many parents stopped sending their kids to schools like Columbia, and instead they sent them to Yeshiva University and Stern College, where they wouldn't have to test their so-called Yetzer Hara. So, and when I was in high school, it was very common, I assume this was the case in other yeshiva high schools at the time, that in your senior year, you went to a kibbutz for a few months. That doesn't exist anymore. Now, what has become the rite of passage for kids in yeshiva day schools, high schools, to spend a year either in yeshiva or a seminary. So the whole Orthodox world has become more and more insulated. And even though the community you and I grew up in was called modern Orthodox, there's much less of the modern in it anymore. The original idea had been that you can lead an Orthodox lifestyle and still be a person of the world and be part of the outside world. I think that over the past few decades, that has become less and less the case. And along with this gravitation toward the right religiously, we've seen that same gravitation toward the right politically.
So, when you were talking before you said the word fear, what was going through my mind was fear. What's different, what's the difference between being able to see a sort of humane vision and giving yourself permission to not bother with that humane vision is fear. Because if you're full of that fear, then, you're in survival mode on a certain, level, and then you don't have to bother with humanity, empathy, compassion. And so I feel like the Jewish world has, the Jewish identity, Jewish culture has always vacillated between these two perspectives, from a perspective of vision of who we are as a people in the world versus a vision of fear. And the problem is that we have a lot of leaders, Jewish leaders, and also in the rest of the world, who like it better when people are fearful. Because when people are fearful, they tend to vote more to the right. They tend to be, less demanding about things like compassionate policies and more, ready to do some really awful things. I mean, that's sort of like human nature. There's actually a line about it in House of Cards. One of the cliffhangers in one season from House of Cards is where you hear Kevin Spacey says, "Oh, fear? We can do fear." Like that's his last line. We can do fear. As if to say, fear is this thing that a political leader can use in order to get compliance, basically compliance. And I feel like that has often been cynically used by some of our current Israeli leaders. Some of our current Israeli leaders have been doing this for a very long time. And the problem is that October 7th fed into all of that. October 7th became like Exhibition A. You see, the whole world hates Jews and all of that. So October 7th became, sort of molded into this like very, gross 3,000-year narrative instead of being about the here and now and real people. So anyway, yeah, I totally agree with your analysis. And also one other thing that I wanted to say is it's interesting that when you talk about the fear that entered sort of modern religious life, the fears have to do with gender, actually. Almost all your examples had to do with gender. Like, oh my God, boys and girls are holding hands. Oh my God, girls are dressing a certain way. So it's like a lot of the fear has to do with loss of patriarchal power, right? It has to do with the fear that, oh my God, women are going to like change things, and then, the patriarchy will have less. So I feel like these things are also connected. I mean, maybe that's a subject for a whole other book,
I
but
didn't think about it, but you're right.
all your
It's,
examples were gendered.
yeah.
They were all gender
Hmm.
examples. Anyway, thank you, Judy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're gonna come back to you. Now we're going to hear from, hang on, we're going to hear now from Becca Strober. I'm going to put you up here. Okay. Hi, Becca.
Hello.
Becca,
Thanks for having me.
you're welcome. My pleasure. And Mazel Tov, Becca has a new baby, so we'll wish you Mazel. Is that okay that I said that to just everybody?
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. We're really excited that he's here.
That's exciting. Mazel Tov. And you should
Thank you.
raise your baby in health and peace and a good world. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let me just introduce Becca. You might follow Becca on Instagram and social media under Becca Explains the Occupation. That's this Becca, the famous Becca of Becca Explains the Occupation. Becca is an American Israeli based in Israel and has dedicated over a decade to educating diverse communities about the mechanics of occupation, about working to combat misinformation by providing clear, well-sourced information. And Becca's extensive experience includes roles as senior director at Breaking the Silence and a whole bunch of other organizations. And Becca has a really interesting backstory too. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. So I was thinking, I thought a bit when I was reading the book what I want to talk about, and then also right now listening to Judy talk, because I was also thinking a lot about that initial conversation that you had on WhatsApp, and the kind of leader of the WhatsApp group messaging you personally and saying, I'm worried about you. Maybe you should go back to being a grandma. As the person who's actually in the country and dealing with these questions and dealing with these realities quite seriously, I know also to say for myself, October 7th was, of course, one of the scariest days of my life. I live near the airport. So very, very early on, from the very first moment that there were sirens here. We were desperately trying to figure out how to get a friend out of the south, who luckily in the end was unharmed. Hamas did not make it to the kibbutz that he was on, but they very well could have. And it was a very big, a very real fear in the moment. And my partner's mom also grew up on a kibbutz in the area, and trying to figure out, who is okay and what's going on, and kind of the frenzy also of information that day. For me, that was the day that I went back onto Twitter after years of being off of it, because that was the only place where you could find information. And I generally have a lot of critique of the Israeli media, but that was probably one of the days where you could really see the panic in the reporters' voices, and they were reporting from what they were hearing from people in the kibbutzes and near the party, and not the opposite. The army wasn't telling them what to say, they were telling the army what to do. And if I can't imagine more of a loss of control than what we felt at that moment. And I also, of course, got a lot of messages from people afterwards. You said that I think we all felt a lot of fear, or just we're quite quieted in those first weeks and months after October 7th from speaking out. And I know that personally affected me a lot. I was really afraid to speak my mind those first days, those first weeks, those first months. But when I did, people also started asking me, I got a lot of similar conversations. And what I think is interesting is that, obviously, so I'm 36, so I'm a millennial. I grew up in Philly. Part of my family's from Jerusalem, so I've always been in Israel back and forth, but I moved here permanently in 2007. So I've been here for half my life. My kid has not served in the army. He's only 5 weeks old, and I hope he never will. But I myself did serve in the army from 2008 and 2010, and I was a shooting instructor. And I spent some time during my service in the West Bank. And what I think is interesting when I read through your book was you were talking about this Jewish Orthodox experience from, a generation or two above mine. And the experience that I grew up in was much more of a progressive, reform Jewish community. The community that I grew up in always spoke of peace, always spoke of the two-state solution, always spoke of progressive politics. And yet so much of the examples are very, very similar. Even though that when you look at them politically, probably also in US politics, though I'm in no way an expert on the Orthodox community in America, but are really, I think, very far away from each other on a bunch of different life experiences inside the US. But when it comes to this question of Israel, are actually quite similar. Except I think that with the community that I grew up in and the community that I work with quite regularly now, meaning the more progressive reform movement Jewish community who I do a lot of work with educating on the occupation, believe that they are having the moral conversation, believe that they're seeing the reality, believe that they are taking the other side into account. And practically, when I was growing up, I think I was 17, I was actually on a program in Israel through the reform movement. And I'd grown up my whole entire life being told that we believe in the two-state solution. It was said in my house, it was said in my synagogue, it was said in the camp that I went to. We believe in the two-state solution. I was only 17 when I actually finally saw a map with the green line and Gaza on it. I had no idea up until that moment what the other state was supposed to be. And I remember feeling a really, kind of like major ping of loss from seeing the map. Oh, we're supposed to give all of that up. And I look to the American Jewish community today, to the progressive American Jewish community today. And on one hand, 20 years has passed since I had that experience personally. And you have seen some political change in the American Jewish world, right? You do have also Jewish American progressive movements that exist right now, by the way, who often exist in the wake of wars in Gaza, right? Like, if not now, started as a group who was saying the Kaddish for civilians who had died in Gaza in 2014, right? That was like how the movement had started. But that you still have US Jewish institutions who actually haven't really they haven't made much progress in terms of being able to have an actual political conversation about what's going on, about the rights of two people to live here, about what the occupation is, about the fact that there's military control. And so also a lot of my friends and people who I've just connected with since October 7th, it was interesting, Judy, you said that you feel that American Jews almost somehow felt October 7th like more personally, even though it happened to us and we were the ones who were here. I felt that same exact experience. I've even met a lot of Jews in the US who now call themselves October 7th or October 8th Jews, meaning October 7th was actually the thing that woke them up into their Judaism. And I think not unlike the core of the Judaism that I grew up with, it wasn't a religious Judaism, right? That's not to say that Reform Judaism doesn't have its religious aspects. We absolutely did, but so much of our connection to Judaism is through Israel, right? I came to Israel when I was 17 on the Reform Movement's program. Talking about the kibbutzes, Judy, that perhaps in your generation you went on, back in the day. We do those trips to Israel, and on one hand, we're not necessarily sitting in settlements, and we're not necessarily, hearing Smotrich's talking points about annexation, but on the other hand, we're not talking at all about the reality as to what is going on. And I think October 7th really pushed that reality even farther. And I experienced it personally. The first time that I guarded a settlement in my Army service, it was, I think, probably in 2009. And I remember just guarding a settlement in the northern part of the West Bank, and there was no fence around the West Bank. And we're like a few soldiers who are there, and we don't have our commander nearby because there's other soldiers on other settlements, and that's kind of how it works. And so the person you're really getting commands from is this civilian security coordinator on the settlement who's supposed to be dealing with the security of the settlement exclusively, but they themselves, of course, have a political goal. And he was the one telling us where to stand. He was the one telling us, if you see the Arab village, Palestinian village, but he said Arab village, that's 150, 250 meters away from us. If you see the Arabs go down into the valley, you have to go kick them out, even though you could clearly see that the valley was their agricultural land, right? And I remember this settlement that didn't have a fence around it. And now I spend every week, I'm in the West Bank, and a lot of settlements don't have fences around them. That's a very, very common practice. But at the time, it surprised me. And I said, well, why don't you put a fence around the settlement, and it'll be so much easier for us as soldiers to guard it. It was such an innocent question, because I joined the army in order to protect the security of Israelis. And he said, he kind of looked around at this one Palestinian village and all the other Palestinian villages, more like farther away. And he looked around, he said, because all of this is ours.
So, that's really interesting. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, and I remember in that moment when I was probably 19 or 20 thinking, oh, okay, I'm upholding a political mission right now. That's my job right now. And I think I spent the rest of my army service training soldiers and sometimes guarding settlements, but I very specifically remember walking away from that moment thinking, American Jews don't get that. No one told this to me. We don't understand it. And then I think you might have to mute yourself because there's a bit of an echo from my, yeah. That we don't understand it. Oh, is this the protecting of Israel that I was taught about in synagogue, that I was taught about in Hebrew school? I went to public school, but that I was taught about in Hebrew school at camp. And I remember going back to my synagogue after guarding that settlement. I mean, when I was in the army, and going to my synagogue for prayers on I think it was Friday night. And afterwards, the rabbi told everyone that, oh, I was coming back from the army and I was a soldier, and everyone like stood up one by one and thanked me for my service. Like 40 people shook my hand. And no one asked me what I was doing, right? The details of it. And I think that post October 7th, this has become that situation, but times 100. It's become that situation on steroids, where you have a lot of the American Jewish community who are having a discourse about Israel, but Israel is not part of the discourse, right? I mean, Israel is not part of the actual conversation. And what I mean is that a lot of the conversation, a lot of people I talk to base their political opinions on Israel right now based on what students in a campus like Columbia, what signs they're holding at a protest, right? Now, that's obviously a relevant conversation to have in terms of Jewish safety in the US, in terms of political messaging, in terms of having a wider camp of who's considered to be on the left, who's considered to be progressive, what do progressive voices include. Those are all really relevant conversations, but they don't actually have to do with the fact that Israel is and has been since day one purposefully been limiting aid into Gaza. And you can use Israel's military data to show that, right? And it doesn't change the fact that Israel increased the amount of civilians that it's willing to kill for lower and lower Hamas members by the tens than what it was willing to do in 2014, which was an increased number from 2008. And it doesn't look into the reality. So many people have messaged me on this Instagram, amongst other places, but also an in-person, of course, education that I do, and have said, Jews just want to live in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank. We just want to live there. Why can't we do that? And, don't understand the reality that in order to make that happen, that security head of that settlement who wants to kick out all of those Arab villages and ethnically cleanse parts of the West Bank, he's doing that right now. I mean, as we speak, over 50 communities in the West Bank have been ethnically cleansed in full, have been kicked out because of settler violence in full. And that settler violence is military backed, right?
I just want to say, yeah, go ahead. I just want to say that
Go.
Yeah. So, I feel like you and I have been like on sort of parallel tracks a little bit. I feel like your story of like being at the center of it and then like unpacking what you're really doing, even though you and I come from like very different places and we're sort of different official generations, this process of like unpacking all of these messages that we were given, it's like really hard work, and you're coming up against things in yourself, and you're also coming up against things in your community. And one of the things that's really resonating with me with what you're describing is I feel like there's two Israels right now. There's Israel, the actual Israel, what Israel is actually doing as a nation among 180 nations of the world, actual power as an authority, a sovereign country, versus Israel, the symbol. Jews
Right.
around the world have had Israel as a symbol for a long time, and that Israel as a symbol is there in everyday prayers and all kinds of pictures on the walls and places to go when you want to go on vacation or whatever. But that and now even more, Israel is the symbol of some kind of like safe haven. So again, it gets back to that fear thing. So Americans are feeling, Jews around the world, not just Americans, also Canadians and Australians. Australians are having a really hard time right now. So Jews around the world are living in some actual real fears. And so Israel is not about what Israel actually is, but it's about some kind of like imaginary symbol or icon that makes people feel better. So like I've had a lot of really strange conversations with Jews from around the world coming to Israel because they think, oh, they're coming to Israel to feel safe. And I'm sort of like, well, Israel is not necessarily safer right now than you may feel like. The Upper West Side of Manhattan is not a safe place because but technically speaking, there are a lot of risks in Israel, but Jews are still coming to Israel because it's that symbol of whatever it is that they want to feel when they're feeling afraid. And so those are two very different things. And it's like they're across, so when you're living in that fear with Israel as the symbol, you can't question that. There's too much at stake. Like, it's like, oh my God, don't question all that. Don't question what Bibi Netanyahu is doing. Don't, upend that. So that's really hard. I've been finding that to be really hard. What about you? I mean, you're on social media all the time. Like, you're right. You're in the middle of all of this on social media, having these really hard conversations. What's that like?
Yeah. It's difficult. I really try and bring the conversation down into into the reality and to stuff that's happening on the ground, and to bring it away from what I think is happening often in the US, which is this kind of like a conversation on a discourse on an academic topic. Settler colonialism. Yes or no, right? Understanding if it is or isn't settler colonialism doesn't necessarily get us any closer to understanding how do we protect communities in Area C of the West Bank, Palestinian communities. Why are they being pushed out? And what's the role of the international community? What's the role of Israelis? And what's the role of the Jewish communities abroad, right? So I really want to bring it to the ground. What I think is most interesting that I find that the American Jewish community struggles with, and I will say, I really genuinely think even American Jews who are more to the right, and October 7th pushed them more to the right, and there are many, those who were pushed more to open up, ask questions, want to find a solution, want to find real solutions so that two peoples, can have self-determination between the river to the sea. There are those people as well. Also in Israel, by the way, most of the work I do with it is with Israelis, like in person. The conversations with young Israelis have gotten so much easier, so much easier. You couldn't convince an 18-year-old Israeli 3 years ago, taking them on a tour in Hebron where Palestinians can't walk outside of their front door for 20 years, you couldn't convince an 18-year-old in Israel that it mattered to them. You couldn't convince them. Now they get that it matters. They get that it matters. And I think with the American Jewish community, you know, back to this part of fear, which I think is really interesting, is that American Jews really understand how a robust democratic society has helped us in America, how civil rights are important in America, how American Jewish communities have been able to thrive because of minority rights, yeah, because of a strong democracy. That same principle people don't want in Israel, including American Jews. Now, progressive American Jews will say they want it because it's something that we, you know, on the progressive side, in the reform movement and in the communities that I grew up in, it's part of our identity. We have to believe that. But when you ask people about it further, right, people want to maintain the status as it is. They want a state that holds Jewish power. That's, you know, a Kahana Ben Gvir concept that holds Jewish power, that allows us to escape to a place where we are the power. And it's completely opposite of what we want in America. In America, we want a robust democracy to keep us safe. And I think that when you talk to the American Jewish progressive community, that's where I find, you know, in the thrust of it, like in Instagram, that people cannot reconcile these two realities. The thing that we believe is inherent in the US to all people is not in Israel. In Israel, we want that, what we feel is a safety net, right? But really it's power, it's control, it's state apparatus that are privileging Jewish people over Palestinians, you know, throughout the river to the sea, may it be in Israel or in occupied territory, in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's a super interesting analysis, Becca. Super interesting. And that's a good segue for us to our next speaker. Thank you, Becca. Stay, yeah. Because we have here also Ilene Prusher. Ilene is going to talk to us a little bit about what her view from America, from Florida, as part of the American Jewish progressive Zionist community. Ilene Prusher is an award-winning journalist, an author, and lecturer, and she joined the staff of Florida Atlantic University after nearly 2 decades abroad, including living in Israel. She's the founder and digital director of MediaLab at FAU, Florida Atlantic University, and she's here, and an author, and she's here to share the perspective from the other side of the Atlantic. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ilana, and thanks for having me today. It's a good question. You know, one time you wonder for yourself, what do I represent in terms of the American Jewish community? And I noticed that I'm the one person, of your panelists who's not in Israel. And you know, it's kind of like just a heartbreak story in a way, because I miss Israel a lot, and yet a lot of the things that were happening in Israel before October 7th, leading up to the attempt to kind of overturn democracy as we know it, were things that were worrying to us. When I say us, I mean as a couple and as a family. I'll say by way of introduction, yes, I spent about 20 years abroad, and about 15 of them were in Israel. It's interesting, this probably wasn't by design, but Becca was just saying that she came from a more reform background, and you and Judy, who I know and is a former colleague at Haaretz, from the modern Orthodox world. I grew up conservative, so we've covered all our bases here. But not super religious, although my dad went to Israel after the Camp David Accords were signed, and he helped implement plans to build air bases in the Negev to boost Israel's security. So when he passed away a little over a year ago, a couple weeks after October 7th, I felt very proud of that. My mom grew up going to Habonim, so very much like labor Zionist background. So I think those, that a little bit informed who I became, but I actually think journalism was really what educated me and shifted, the standard Zionism that I got when I went to Tel Aviv University as an undergrad. And I think things started to shift for me, really, quite honestly, when I had the privilege of seeing things in person, which I did as a journalist not long after the Oslo Accords were signed. I'm close to in age to you, Ilana, so I got to spend about half of the 90s covering, the attempt at, I think some of us thought it was heading towards a two-state solution. Not everybody obviously believed in that. And the Accords were sadly not very specific about where they were leading. So I got to cover that whole segment, left, to cover other parts of the Middle East, and then came back in 2005 and spent the next 10, 11 years until I came here to Florida, and that's nearly 10 years ago. And I have to say, it's not been easy being someone who, still, loves Israel and yet is highly critical both of Israeli policy or the Israeli government. And, I'm thinking of some of the anecdotes that you shared both in the book and some of the panelists have shared that were so moving. And I think of a time, I think it was, this was around 2018 when I was already here for a couple of years. And if you guys can remember that time when there was a day of rage and a lot of Palestinians tried to rush the fence with Gaza, and about 60 people were killed in a day. And I wrote, and I was just looking them up now. I wrote some things in Haaretz. I wrote some things in Time magazine that was saying, could Israel have used water cannons to repel people? Not that their water cannons are great, but they don't kill people the way that live fire does. And I got so much criticism in my community here in South Florida. I live in Boca Raton now, and my husband teaches at a Jewish day school. And one comment that really stayed with me, one was someone saying well, I'm a real Zionist. I really care about Israel, and I think, well, are you citizens? Have you lived there? Have you served there? And I didn't say all of that, but it's painful. And I feel like being just part of this call is like being in good company with like minds that are inquisitive and basically wanting to bring about a better day. And even like using the word occupation, which would roll off my tongue every day when I lived in Israel, I use carefully around here, and I'm careful in whose company I use it, because I don't necessarily want to end up in political fights with people in the same place that I like to daven on Shabbat. But I'm thinking of a conversation we had a bunch of Jewish friends on New Year's Eve this year, just over a month ago. And one person was saying, it's still the most moral army in the world. And a friend and I were like, I'm not so sure that's really true. I don't know. Most armies are not moral. They're there. What they do is they're fighting, they're defending, they're doing a lot of killing, and and I don't know about that. And I felt like one of the things. Let's circle back to your book more than talking about myself. That really speaks to me is the fact that in this book that you did, as you said in the beginning, you preferred in the past, and I've read some of your other books. I remember when your book about the war on women in Israel came out. I loved, the way that you took on some of the issues there. And in this book, I think that you do a really wonderful job of weaving in the personal and the political, and also, speaking in a very current way about how difficult it is. And I just really felt for you when you were, you told the story in the beginning, you tell in the book when you're kind of like, why don't you leave this, why don't you go back to being a grandma? I've had my share of it, and it's really hard. And sometimes you just want to put your head under the covers and just talk with the people who agree with you. But we have to keep getting out there and speaking our truth. And I know I see some of the names on this call, like Joanna Chen and Ruth Ebenstein, and people I know who are doing that on a daily basis. So I think that's really very important. I love the part of your book, I have to say, where you talk about this essay that you wrote in Lilith in 2014 called My Political Evolution. I didn't know about that essay, but now I'm going to go read it. But it's around that time too. I remember I was still living in Israel when that war happened in 2014. And I wrote a piece actually for Haaretz that had a headline that was something along the lines, in Israel or Gaza declaring sympathy for the other side is a no-go zone. And all I had done was put up a post about how I had run to a shelter with my then two small babies, and it went through my mind, a mother in Gaza has no shelter to run to, and people were like, outraged with that. So it's really hard to hold on to your empathy, and yet I believe we have to keep doing it, and we have to challenge others to do it. I want to draw attention to everyone who's here to celebrate your book today to something that really spoke to me, because it's both relevant for what's happening in Israel and in America. As I was preparing for this call, I just saw that President Trump withdrew temporary protected status for 300,000 Venezuelans. And I had this kind of like moment of, still trying to absorb all the radical change that's happening here. And this is what you wrote on page 41. But what do we do when the experience or the narrative we so desperately want to embrace is something of a lie? Well, we know what people generally do. They tend to stick to what's comfortable and ignore the rest. If we ever had doubts about the human psyche's ability to ignore facts and reality because people are attached to something being shown to them, we only need to look at America since 2016. Our minds are apparently ready to hang on to some awful ideas by ignoring the worst, as long as those ideas feed some kind of deep need. Am I shocked by this cognitive dissonance? I don't know. We've lived it for a long time. I guess I want to throw in, I know that I just saw that someone needed to go, so we're rounding up towards the hour, is that, one of the struggles right now is sort of, when you're kind of presenting, the need to get back to, some kind of, well, first we need for hostages to come home and but thank God we're at least at a ceasefire now. But, will the ceasefire stick? Is the intention to, for Israel to resettle parts of Gaza? Are there potential solutions? People ask me this regularly. So I'm so glad that your book details some of them in part 3. So I'm going to actually recommend it to a few people who have been asking me, because I think people are, people in the American Jewish community are, living, with the thought of what happened on October 7th, could happen again. People weren't, and it's weird, but there is some research that shows that even watching videos of it can be traumatizing for people who didn't live through it. And I think they look at that and they think, there's no hope. So we have to just keep fighting. And I see my community in South Florida bringing in speakers, who often give out that message. There's no point in negotiating or thinking that that's going to happen. I like to hold on to a little bit of optimism and believe that there is, and feel like my work as a journalist over the years, spending so much time in the West Bank and Gaza, makes me think that vast majority of Palestinians would not have chosen this war and don't really want Hamas. But some polls sometimes show otherwise. When I was on a trip back to Israel in May, I had a Palestinian friend who said, well, I don't like Hamas, but we all support the resistance. And I was still like stewing on that for months later, trying to figure out what does that mean for her? What does it mean to me? How are we going to move forward with this? But I know that time is tight. I just want to say, I'm so glad for your book, and I think it's important. I know there's some people today who maybe have read it, and probably some who haven't, but we all need to read it, and maybe even get some book groups together to discuss it. Maybe whether here in America, in Israel, across different communities, possibly to be, help us have the conversation about where we're going to go from this, and how, can we have somebody, I would love someone like a Becca, to come and speak at my community, and not always someone who basically says, I have no space for worrying about the other side right now. I'm still on October 7th. I mean, that was literally what someone who's my husband's supervisor at the day school told him, a month or two ago, when he was trying to like introduce students who were high school seniors to different narratives. I don't have space for it. We need to make the space. We need to make the space to have the conversation and to be aware of the humanity of the other side. So a lot of mazel tov on this amazing work that you've done. And thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for reminding me, by the way, that we've known each other for a while, because in 2014, while you were working at TLV1, we did a radio program about the war on women in Israel. So first of all, thank you for that. And also thank you for reminding me how many amazing people are on this call. Wow. Leah Lax is here also, and Ruth Evanstein, and my friend Jessica is here, and yeah, lots of hi to all of you. Really, I'm really honored that you're all here. I also want to, before we wrap up, I also want to give a shout out to my husband Jacob, who is doing the tech side tonight. Shani Bob, who usually helps me with the tech side, is doing on baby duty right now, and my husband stepped in. We've been together for 37 years. I just want to tell you, 37 years we've been together, and we've been through a lot of these changes together. So he gets like a huge shout out for rolling with the punches with me. I just want to put that there. Anyway, I did want to comment about what you said, Eileen, about empathy, because I feel like what you touched on, what feels to me to be the core issue here. The core issue has to do with whether or not we're taught, whether or not we're capable of seeing people through a human lens, even if they're different from us, right? Even if they're from a radically different background, culture, upbringing, whatever, different religion, different language. Can we feel empathy? And I feel like the world that we're living in, this like Trumpy world that we're living in, has legitimized not doing it. It has totally legitimized the idea that if someone is not like you, you are allowed to wish them unwell. You're allowed to want to control them. You're allowed to not care if they die, effectively. And we see that like in a zillion ways, whether it's kids in cages or women having reproductive rights or whatever. So this issue with Palestinians in Gaza is like almost one more of many iterations of that lack of empathy. And so we have some people writing here. Let's look a little bit at the so I just wanted to say thank you for that. And also, it's really cool that in 2014 you and I were writing similar articles, right? We were writing similar ideas in different places, and that's like super cool. Like, wow, okay. 2014, I kept that article on my political evolution in Lilith because it was a real turning point in my life. It was actually a real turning point, which I share in the book. Okay, let's see what some of these. We'll go backwards. Tammy Shell, hi Tammy, how are you? Learning through the lens of caring. Yes, Tammy is a professor whose area of expertise is caring. So
Right.
and also we have Ruth. Ruth writes. Hi, Ruth. It's so nice to have you here. I also invited Ruth to be a panelist. She's super busy, but one day Ruth and I are going to have a conversation about this book and about lots of other things. So Ruth says it seems like it's being championed, not just allowed, meaning the absence of empathy. Yes, being able to seeing people through a human lens, even if they're different from us. Yes, yes. Okay, what else? That's Joanna Chen. Hi, Joanna. Seeing people through a human lens, even if they're different from us. Yes, that's like the whole thing, really, isn't it? Leah, just ordered. Thank you, Leah. Leah, you also have your own trajectory here. If you haven't read Leah Lax's book, you totally should. And so while we're talking about books, what else? This is a complete topic of its own. Oh, I don't know which topic that was. But okay, it's problematic to read the questions backwards because then I'm like, oh, what was said before that? Okay, we're over our hour. Does anybody want to ask a question? I'm gonna just open it up very quickly to see. Does anybody want to ask a question before we go? How to get people who don't necessarily agree to read the book? Hi, Renee. Renee was one of my beta readers and proofreader. Thank you, Renee. That's a really excellent question. I mean, how do we have these conversations, right? That's one of the things, Eileen, you were asking about. Like, how do we have these conversations where it's hard, I don't have a good answer. Do you? Eileen, hang on. I'm going to just put all my speakers back up here in the spotlight for a second.
I mean, while you're doing that, I'll say it's a great question. Like I'm asking, in my own synagogue here in Boca, some people I probably could get to, and then other people, would refuse, right? So I think it's a great question. It's a challenge to us as writers, and some of us are journalists and human rights activists. Like how do we get these ideas, and information in front of more people, and at least having the conversation with more people, and not just talking amongst ourselves, so to speak.
Judy, Becca, do you have any thoughts you want to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's the $1 million question, right? How do you get people to do it? But I think that one thing that I loved about the book was you use a lot of personal stories And I think that once it's personal, it, you know, instead of being judgmental towards the outside, is a reflection of your own journey. And that allows more people to reflect themselves. And so, you know, I would say even sharing with someone a chapter, you know, taking it out of context of the whole book, sharing a chapter is a great way to get people to hear that voice, hear your voice, Elana.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions here. Ruth Evanstein has a question. Ruth, I'm unmuting you. Yes? Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you. Hi, yes, I'm sorry, I'm taking care of. Oh, do you want to mute? Should I only, yeah, okay, great. So first of all, this was fascinating and wonderful. Just to give a little background about me. So yes, I'm a journalist and I'm a peace activist, but beyond peace activism is like one of my best friends is Palestinian who lives on the other side. Other side, of course, is not my understanding of it, but that's how it is understood, let's say, in the world. And, you know, she was saying she was sobbing watching the hostages come out. And she's like, I can't post that. You know, it's funny because when you talk about 2014, I mean, Netanyahu was already using like the pogrom language in Kishinev, like in 2014. So the whole issue of fear is not, it didn't start now. It's been going on. And it really like, Ibtisam and I started telling the story of our friendship in 2014 because it felt like that's the worst it could get. You know, that seemed so terrible and it couldn't get worse than that. So what I find can be helpful is sometimes you sort of say to someone, you know, you're really certain in your perspective. Why don't you read this even to tell her why she's wrong? You know, aren't you curious to hear what she's telling herself, even if you think it's nonsense? I mean, she's actually got a whole book. So what is she saying? And so that I think sometimes works, but I would just say it's interesting that I became a peace activist in response to what was going on, and now it's not even safe, neither for me nor for Ibtisam, in certain ways to be really open about our friendship and our relationship. So it's like kind of ridiculous. The first person to call me on October 7th was Ibtisam, my friend who lives in Abu Dis. And then, but now we have to kind of not highlight it for her safety. And, you know, it's the same thing of like the kid, whatever, it's just with the current climate. So I think part of it is being able to sit tight a little bit and see what is going to happen now and how people are going to be able to relate to it. But I think understanding that there are other people who will not be able to have this conversation right now. And can we take a deep breath and understand that? I'm not happy about it. I think I'm maybe more realistic in that sense. But I do find that if you turn it into almost an intellectual exercise or an opportunity to engage and, you know, like say, well, does it make sense to really discount me? Do you really think I do this all the time? All the time I ask people, like when they say all the Palestinians, I was like, well, do you know any Palestinians? You know, the Gazans, Hamas. And I was like, well, the people who live in Abu Dis, I was like, 2 million people live in Gaza. You really think all 2 million are like that? I was like, the baby that was born 3 weeks ago. So
I talk about that all the time also, about people who talk about, you know, all the Palestinians, all the Gazans. It's like we were experts when I was 14 years old and I took my Zionism class. I was an expert on what Palestinians think and what. I had never met a Palestinian or read anything by a Palestinian ever, but I was like the expert on what all Palestinians are. So anyway, thank you for that, Ruth. And also, your work also with Ibtisam is so important and so inspiring. So inspiring. You should all follow Ruth also. Thank you, Ruth. I'm going to go to the next question. Is that okay? Yeah.
Of course.
Abby P. I'm going to bring up Abby P. over here.
Hi, Elana. Thanks for this chat. And I've been following Becca for a long time on Instagram, and I really appreciate what she has done so far, what she does. Thanks, Becca, for that. My question is that I'm not sure if you all have recently watched to the Harvard professor Ruth Weiss. Sorry. She gave a talk and she was addressing the American Jewish community, and she had so many expectations from her. She was saying that you don't have to serve in the military But after the military is over, that's when your real work starts. You need to be the spokesperson of Israel. You need to fight the battle that is not on the ground, but in media, and you need to present the Israeli side. And to me, that felt like there's so much of how do you say, pressure, peer pressure that's been going on from generation to generation. How could you break away from that? Where would you start, if you have to challenge that narrative?
Yeah, I think that's what we're talking about. Some of the examples we've been hearing have to do with humanizing the other. It has to do with, really, because at the core is the dehumanization of the other, the lack of empathy. They go together, the lack of empathy, the dehumanization, the fear. And so to undo that, it really requires a lot of just humanizing, seeing real stories, real people, meeting real people, having real conversations. I feel like, a lot of the work that Ruth was describing with Ibtisam has to do with that, has to do with putting a real face and a real name. Israeli media, we don't even really see Palestinian faces and Palestinian names and Palestinian stories. They're not part of the media coverage, really. And so that I think, even just, that undoing the process of dehumanization, that to me feels like it's, at the core. Susan, my cousin Susan Jackson, says to me here, would love to hear you mention the Palestinian woman on my podcast. So yeah, I'm going to give a little shout out to the podcast. I have a podcast called Women Ending War that I do with Palestinian partners, and you're all welcome to listen to it. Becca's been on the podcast, so we're going to take one last question here, and then I'm going to scroll up and see. I think I missed some comments here. Michelle Tan, hi Michelle. I'm trying to see if we can get a few copies. If you're interested in bulk ordering of the book, this is sort of going away from ideology towards practice, logistics. Contact me directly. I can arrange a bulk order for you. That would be so nice, and thank you. And here we have the MO in my work, Leah Lax, writes, is to have these conversations. The operative phrase, radical listening. Radical listening. Yeah, I love that. Thank you, Leah. Okay, our last question from Miriam Bruckman. Yes?
Thank
Hang on.
you. Yeah, hi. My name's
Yeah.
Miriam.
Yes, hi.
I'm a preschool teacher and I'm studying to become a therapist. I think a lot about my Israeli and Jewish identity from different perspectives. I also grew up on the East Coast, and then I moved to Israel when I was 5, until I was 27, and now I live in Washington State in the US. First of all, I want to say that I appreciate your book and your podcast so much. I wrote in one of the comments that I really appreciate your integrity and your humbleness when you're discussing really hard topics and overcoming challenges. So that's very inspiring. For me, I have a question. I'll just give a quick introduction. For me, October 7th opened up an intense intellectual analysis and an in-depth and very open dive into the beliefs that I have or had. One issue that's been coming up for me a lot in my intellectual contemplations is one that was also strengthened by your book, and it's about how to disentangle the pride of Jewish peoplehood with military pride. I grew up with a deep sentiment of connection to the land and the people and the Jewish community and culture in Israel. I was in a mechina before the army, and I was a teacher in the army and involved in all sorts of young Zionist activist programs. And that sentiment is very strong in me, even though my political ideas have changed very much since then. But I think the idea of giving all that up is very scary, and that cultural sentimental context is fundamental to many people. So it makes me wonder if there's a way to keep that sentiment but change what's at its core and the violence involved in it. Like, can we change our narrative and our future and still maintain the beautiful parts of being Israeli? I used to always say that the Israeli military is different from all the militaries in the world, and I felt that way very strongly. I felt that maybe because it's so intertwined with Israeli culture, which I loved. And slowly I had to come to terms with the fact that it's kind of at odds with my beliefs in nonviolent conflict resolution and things like that. So I'm trying to reconcile with that, and I wonder what people think about that.
Do any of the panelists want to take that question? It's a really powerful question, and a really important one. Becca, is that you raising your hand?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can try because I think I went through and still go through often like that same exact like how do I like unmarriage or whatever the word is, like these two things together. And like you said that you were a teacher in the army, so like maybe you were in like the education corps and it's like am bonnet va bonnet am, like the people build an army, build a people. And it's like it's literally a part of how the society is built. It's so intertwined with the military, and it's so intertwined with this very specific narrative, I think, that has become almost inherent to what it means to be Israeli. Of we think of it as defense, a lot of what we do, and there are aspects that are defense, right? It's not like I think that we're never defending, but we think of it as inherently as defense. But a lot of that defending has become really zero sum, where the zero sum then means that like Palestinians existing means we need to defend ourselves from them, and then we're actually often on the offense. And I think it's really hard. But one of the things that I've found personally, and this was an incredibly like painful process that I went through like for years, was that I do think that Israeli society, and on some levels, even when we move past this current reality and we transition to justice and we recognize that there are two peoples here and we have a political system that recognizes that, and I do believe we'll get there, there's still going to be a place for Israeli culture, Israeli narrative, Israeli Hebrew, and maybe I hope it'll look also demilitarized. So much of our conversations, like so much of the words that we use in regular day are like military words. But once we don't have to constantly serve and uphold this trajectory that we're currently on of privilege over Palestinians in this land, or even supremacy over Palestinians in this land, then I think we're also going to be able to uncouple ourselves from that aspects of the culture, and I think that like I personally find a lot of comfort in things like Hebrew literature and Hebrew, a lot of Hebrew songs. Again, not all of them. Some of them in themselves are also very militaristic, but I think that a lot of them aren't. And I think, it's one place where I personally also find myself very different from a lot of the people who are speaking abroad kind of about decolonization, that all of Israeli culture is, a kind of like colonized, like a colonizing culture, if you will. No, I think there are very real things that have come from this kind of like gathering of Jews from all these different places, and they're real and they have meaning. And we become a collective because of collective experience. And I think that a lot of that we're going to be able to hold on to. Right now, it's a messy process. And I'm not sure that there's one, clear answer of take this and this no, and, we'll throw that out and we'll move forward with this. But I do think that there's a lot of places in Israeli society that actually once we, I don't know, once we figure out that we don't have to erase Palestinian identity and the Palestinian people in order for us to be here, it's also going to give us an ability to breathe and say, I think in general as Israelis, we often don't have the opportunity to say, what do we really want? What do we really need? What's really important to us? And that's going to give us the opportunity to do that, and to be able to really cherish those aspects of our culture and our peoplehood, Like Shabbat dinners, like the best thing we have in Israel that Americans don't do enough.
I love that answer, Becca. I love the question. I really love the question about who we are when we stop being, all about the military and violence and having to, discount the other. Who will we be then? And I love Becca's answer that there's a lot we can't hang on to, but we can't really access that until we fix this in ourselves, because that we have to fix this first. That's what I believe. I mean, I think, Becca, you're right. That it's all there, and it was really a very beautiful answer. I loved your answer. Judy, Eileen, do you want to say anything else?
Looks like Judy is unmuting, so I'll.
I just unmuted. No, all I wanted to say was Ilana, when you discover the secret to getting your book into all these supposedly hostile spaces, please let me know what it is, because maybe it will help us at Haaretz sell some subscriptions. You know what people say about Haaretz, right?
Well, you know, BB is trying to actually close down Haaretz, so there's that. That should tell you everything you need to know. But yeah, it's a really hard thing. Again, it has to do with this issue of empathy, of being willing to like open your mind and open your heart to things that are outside of like your tribe. It's hard, it's complicated, but that's the
No,
work.
well, you know, when we try to get people to read the paper, they usually say, well, I don't like what you write. And I often say, it's not a matter of liking. We're, at least in our news department, we're writing what happened. You may not like what happened, but we're just
Yeah.
giving you the truth.
Yeah.
You know, some people don't want to face that.
Yeah. Everybody should subscribe to Haaretz.
And
Okay.
everyone should buy your book.
Thank you.
I agree with
We
both
should
of
maybe
those
do
things.
some sort of deal, you know? Like a deal,
Yes.
get Haaretz, get the book
Right.
with it.
Right. I was actually thinking, Lana, I don't know if you're signing up to do the Jewish Book Council, where they try to offer you to speak at different Jewish book gatherings, festivals, JCCs around the country here in the US. But I think that would be great. And, you know, I hope that lots of people will be open to at least, you know, learning more about it. And you know, it just, you know, your opening anecdote there is just kind of mind blowing. Like you'd think that people would get that someone who like lives it, you know, not just living it, but like, you know, the way you describe that it impacts, you know, your children, people serving, you know, living with it day to day. You know, I would hope that it, you know, opens a lot of minds. That's really my hope for your book, in the way that certain books that I've read over the years, you know, have done that for me. I'm hoping that it's seen that way. And it's painful living in an environment where I feel like some people try to own like the Israel narrative, and it's like it only has to be, you know, one story, and it's obviously just like a much more complicated story. I hope we're turning a page in a better direction, but I'm not sure. And I'm so glad that you've written this book, and I hope it will get into a lot of good hands and open a lot of minds.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for reminding us about what the work is here. Like, this is the work. You know, this is the work, is to have these hard conversations. It's, you know, it's like on all of us, you know. And what I really wanted to do with this book was sort of give real tools for how to like sort of how to address what needs to be addressed. So I'm hoping that will, you know, that will start here, or not start. I'm not starting. I would not like to suggest that I'm starting this work. There are 164 organizations in Israel that are dedicated to a different way. So, you know, but I would like to contribute to that. I feel like this is the work. The work is learning how to open up the question of like who we are. What does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be a Jewish state? What does it mean for us? Does it mean that we just belong to our tribe, or does that mean that we carry an ethos with us? Can we be a Jewish state when to be a Jewish state means to care about all human beings? I mean, that's really the challenge. So thank you. Thank you. Somebody asked in the questions, you know, where this is recording is going to be available. We're going to be sharing the recording, you know, across all of our social media channels. And please, please, please contact me anytime if you want to chat. You know, I have lots of chats with people all the time about all of this stuff. If you would like to come on my podcast, if you feel like you have something to share, let me know. If you have other people you'd like to introduce me to who are partner with, doing similar work, I love partnering. I love collaborating, strength in numbers, and supporting each other. And again, please reach out to me. You can find me on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Bluesky. It's Bluesky, Blue Sky. I call it Bluesky. It's my old, you know, Russian accent. Like, find me on Bluesky. Sorry. And anyway, you know, you can write to me at ilana@jewfem.com. I get those emails. And thank you. Thank you, Judy, Becca, Eileen. Thank you. Thank you to all the people who are here. Thank you to Jacob on the back end. And please stay in touch, and let's give each other strength in this hard work, and prayers for peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilana.
Ilana, can I just
Thank you,
say,
Elana.
Who?
pursuant to what Eileen said about affecting your life,
Yeah.
Like, hello, your children all moving in with you. Can we talk about that in the United States? Everybody moving
Next
into their
podcast
parents'
we'll talk.
house, like much bigger. And I'm just saying, like, hello, do you guys, do you realize you said that out loud, people? Like, now I do think there's like a thing about minority, majority, and I haven't got a chance to read the book. I'm taking care of my dad who's Parkinson's. But yes, like, I mean, it is an absurd scenario. It almost sounds like a skit.
It's been a crazy year for everybody in Israel. It's been crazy. Anyway, Jessica was waving. Jessica, I love you. Suze, love you also. Okay. Bye. Take care. Have a great
Thank you,
day,
Jacob.
evening, afternoon.
Good work.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bravo, it was fabulous.
Bye. Thank you.